Hey everyone. Tonight we're starting with something a little darker. The first great migration of humans. We're going to dive into real life in the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry that Hollywood has sold you. Africa, before the journey stretches in. Quiet breath, its rhythms measured by rain and stone. In East Africa, Rift Valley stepped down toward broad basins, volcanic highlands. Cool the air in alternating belts of savanna and woodland shape where small. Bands collect water fuel and nappable rock. The time is the late Pleistocene, roughly 60 to 70 millennia before the present when climate cools and dries as global ice advances and deserts breathe outward. Monsoon belts weaken and shift. Lakes withdraw from their margins. Corridors of green narrow, and then reopen in slow pulses. Groups move with these pulses setting. Camp where spring holds through the dry months, returning to a lake shore. When storms reappear and learning by habit the sequence of places that sustain them. Across this landscape, Middle Stone Age technologies are steady and exacting. Cores are prepared with practice efficiency, then struck to free flakes and points by the level of method shapes, meant for cutting, scraping, and hafting as spear tips. Fire is tended often. Ash and charcoal layer the floors of caves and open-air camps. Ochre nodules are ground to a fine. Powder that binds with fat or plant gum. Pigments mark hides or objects and, perhaps bodies evidence of continuity in social signaling. Little details persist. In the sediment, a run of marine shells carried inland far beyond the reach of salt spray, an ostrich eggshell bead pierced and rounded by careful grinding, a shard of obsidian whose chemistry points to a source more than 100 kilometers away. These traces imply exchange or movement across distances that, while modest, within a single season accumulate across lifetimes. The environment narrows and opens in. Long pulses that a person can feel across a lifetime. During humid phases, grass thickens and gallery forests braid rivers with shade. During dry spells, dunes creep and water holes turn brackish and then bitter, ringing there. Margins with salt crust. People adapt by fissile infusion families, separating to forage and then rejoining around a hearth when resources allow. Stone points are resharpened. Again and again. Broken tips are inverted and rebused. Fragments travel. In toolkits from camp to camp, the edges refresh as often as the seasons. Themselves, mobility is planned around dependable features. A spring shaded by fig roots. A basalt ridge that catches wind. A marsh edge where fish can be trapped as water retreats. The larger planet presses gently upon these local choices. To the far north, ice sheets thicken and expand, locking up ocean water and lowering global sea level by tens of meters. Shorelines step outward in wide tidal. Flats replace drowned margins, remembered a few generations earlier. Exposed continental shelves create foraging grounds rich in shellfish and stranded pools. Estuaries lengthen into winding arms. Coral heads that once lay below the waves emerge on extreme low tides. Winds strengthen and carry dust across basins. The position of storm tracks shifts, connecting distant regions through linkedity and rain. In this planetary setting, people at a small lakeside hearth feel outcomes rather than causes a late monsoon, a shoreline farther from camp, animals clustering differently along a shrinking wetland. Archaeology records this life as fragments whose accumulation is persuasive. A platform angle on a core preserves a napper's choice. A hearth circle stains the ground with charcoal. A bead shows the polish of a cord that once passed through it. At coastal caves in East Africa, layers dated to roughly 65,000 years ago include worked shells, pigments, and finely made points, a combination, suggesting stable skill and social investment during variable climate. Farther inland, ostrich eggshell beads appear in numbers that imply patience, work under low light, and in some levels, marine shells rest among ash. Despite the sea lying far away, a small but striking detail that hints at movement or exchange, residues on grinding stones record. Starch and pigment, a quiet testimony to varied diets and the preparation of color. Genetic evidence will later show that populations in this period are small in structure with subgroups who meet mix and separate along ecological seams. Effective population size, estimates inferred from modern genomes and ancient DNA suggest that even as Homo sapiens flourishes across the African continent, the number of breeding adults in any one region can be modest. Connectivity matters, contact corridors matter, and isolation when climate closes a route matters. This structure becomes important in later dispersal, because only a subset of this diversity will leave the continent and seed populations elsewhere. Some questions remain unresolved and are likely to stay that way. How much does climate alone drive the pattern of movement, and how much do social innovations expand options in a cooling world? Did pigments and ornaments primarily mark identity or also encode routes and obligations among distant partners? How often did groups cross wide exposed shelves to new fishing grounds? And were such traverses intentionally timed to spring tides? The sedimentary record gives outlines rather than intentions, and the gap between behavior and the traces it leaves is acknowledged matter-of-factly by those who study it. Night offers reliable reference. Stars hold their positions, and along open plains or broad lakes, people use familiar constellations to align travel with morning destinations known from earlier seasons. Daylight enforces other rules. Water dictates distance and timing. Journeys start before heat blurs the air. Embers, wrapped in plant fiber, and ash seed the next fire without the effort of new sparks. Children learn the order places, spring to grove to ridge to marsh, and the habits that make each leg predictable, where reeds can be cut, where shade falls first, where flint nodules whether from a tuft of grass after the rains. Across generations, all of this movement adds up to distances measured in thousands of kilometers, traced as loops that repeat with variations rather than as a straight line. From a planetary view, the path is still local, contained within eastern Africa's broad arc, yet falling seas shift the shoreline so profoundly that remembered coves move outward and the mouths of rivers lengthen like new corridors. The coast is not a highway, yet it offers continuity predictable calories from. Shellfish and fish reliable water from seeps orientation by the unbroken line, where waves break. Inland lakes that shrink and grow create similar ribbons of stability. People follow these margins, testing new inlets and marshes as they appear, returning to those that persist. In this first setting, before the major departure, nothing announces an epical change. Camps remain small. Tools are reparable. Food is gathered with the same. Careful attention to seasons and tides, yet the combined effect of cooler climate, lower seas, extended shorelines, and durable networks of contact creates a landscape that both constrains and invites. To the northeast, a narrow straight will at times contract to a water gap of a few dozen kilom, the sort of crossing that can be attempted by people already used to reading tides and exploiting nearshore waters. Whether such passages are deliberate projects or opportunistic responses to the right wind and current is still debated. The scene holds that twilight hearts breathe under careful tending birds, settle on reeds along a retreating lake, and stone points lie arranged by size and used beside a sleeping space. The present tense is ordinary, steady, and sufficient. The people who live here are not preparing for a great leap. They are practicing habits that make long dispersal feasible whenever conditions align. The record they leave, cores with consistent angles, shells carried far. From their beaches, pigments ground to a fine red dust, anchors the opening of the story in evidence. While the planet's slow, measurable shifts set the horizon toward which they will move. Shadows of the past bottleneck stretch back hundreds of millennia, shaping the fragile lineage now poised to expand. Genetic studies in the present reveal that all living humans descend from populations whose numbers at certain times in prehistory dropped to levels small enough that their survival was not guaranteed. One of the most significant of these events occurred roughly 900,000 Years ago, when changing climates and ecological shifts across Africa appear to have reduced early human ancestors to a mere few thousand breeding adults for many generations, the causes remain under study. Some models point to prolonged drought cycles, others to habitat fragmentation, as grasslands contracted and forest belts shifted, still others to complex ecological pressures from both predators and competition with other hominin species. Whatever the mix of forces, the genetic signature of that ancient bottleneck endures in the DNA of Homo sapiens. Today, a subtle record of survival through scarcity, more recent and more relevant to the story unfolding 70,000 years ago, is another constriction in human diversity. Around this time, genetic evidence suggests that only a relatively small subset of African populations contributed ancestry to all non-African peoples. This was not the only human lineage on Earth. Neanderthals thrived across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans persisted farther east, and other archaic groups held territories not yet known to Homo sapiens. But it was the one that would spread widely and endure. Archaeological sites from this period show a mixture of resilience and constraint. Coastal caves in South Africa and Eastern Africa hold layers of occupation where people weathered difficult conditions by intensifying the use of local resources. Shellfish collected in larger quantities, small game trapped or driven into enclosures, plant foods processed with grinding stones to release more energy from starch. Such strategies imply both knowledge and the capacity to transmit across generations traits that may have been critical to enduring the population squeeze. Inland sites suggest equally adaptive responses, seasonal movement between highlands and lowlands to balance temperatures and resource availability, exploitation of freshwater sources during prolonged dry spells, the storage of food in pits or containers fashioned from plant material, a single bead of marine shell found far from the coast in. This period hints at exchange networks linking otherwise isolated groups, allowing not only goods but also information and mating partners to move across the landscape. The precise trigger for the later late Plian bottleneck remains a matter of careful debate. Some researchers point to the massive eruption of Mount Toba in Sumatra around 74,000 years ago, which lofted vast quantities of ash and aerosols into the atmosphere. Climate models suggest it could have caused years of cooler temperatures and altered rainfall patterns, but the degree of its global impact remains contested. Other scholars note that African climate records already show strong drying trends before Toba linked to the waxing of ice sheets and changes in monsoon dynamics. In either case, the archaeological and genetic evidence together depict a time when human populations were not only small but also widely scattered, connected by narrow corridors of contact. From a planetary perspective, the forces at play are immense and indifferent. Ice accumulates in the high latitudes, locking away ocean water and reshaping coastlines. Wind belts shift equatorward, carrying less moisture into the tropics and pushing desert margins farther into formerly green zones. The Sahara expands a vast barrier between North African populations and those to the south and east. In East Africa, lakes drop and fragment into smaller basins. Rivers slow and retreat. These environmental changes fragment human habitats into patches, each supporting only limited numbers of people. In such a world, the chance loss of a key resource, one reliable spring, one grove, of fruiting trees can force movement or lead to the disappearance of local group. Survival in this context depends on a balance between mobility and stability. Families move to track resources yet must return to familiar locations to maintain the social connections that guard against inbreeding and isolation. These connections, in turn, are the threads that allow cultural knowledge where to find water in a drought year, how to prepare an otherwise toxic route when to set fish traps before the rains to persist. The archaeological record hints at this delicate weave. In one sequence, layers of occupation at a rock shelter show alternating periods of intensive use and long abandonment, suggesting that groups visited during favorable conditions, but retreated when the local climate turned against them. Charcoal analyses indicate shifts in the species that would burn over time, possibly reflecting changes in vegetation as rainfall patterns fluctuated. Stone tool assemblages preserve continuity in core preparation techniques even as raw material sources. Change a sign that knowledge persisted even when landscapes and supplies did not. The small effective population size implied by genetic models also means that any group leaving Africa in this period would carry only a fraction of the total genetic variation present on the continent. This fact has lasting consequences. All people outside Africa today share a subset of African diversity, a living reminder of the bottleneck's narrowing effect. Yet, within that small group lies the capacity for adaptation to almost every terrestrial environment on the planet, from equatorial rainforest to subarctic tundra. That potential is already visible in the archaeological hints of flexibility sites that combine marine and terrestrial foods, tools suited for multiple functions, pigments that may mark group identity or signal shared rituals across distances. Questions remain unresolved. Did the late Plein bottleneck result primarily from climate-driven habitat loss or from stochastic events like disease outbreaks? Within small, vulnerable populations, how many separate dispersals out of Africa occurred before the one that seeded today's global population? And how many of those earlier foray ended without lasting descendants? Are we missing key evidence because rising seas have drowned Pluto and shorelines where early coastal groups might have lived? The search for answers spans disciplines from DNA sequencing to sediment sing, yet accepts the limits of preservation and time. On the ground, 70,000 years ago, none of this is framed as a bottleneck or a genetic legacy. It is the daily work of finding enough to eat, keeping the fire alive, avoiding predators, and remembering the roots that tie one camp to another. People are aware of who lives beyond the next ridge or across the next dry valley, and they know the signs of strangers' hearts or discarded tools. Exchange, whether through direct meeting or through chains of intermediaries, maintains a thread of connection in an otherwise fragmented world. From a higher vantage, the interplay of climate, landscape, and population size is part of the planet's slow pulse. Glaciers grow and retreat. Deserts expand and contract. Seas rise and fall. And human numbers respond in kind, sometimes expanding into new niches, sometimes contracting into refuges. The late Plein is a time when contraction dominates, yet the seeds of expansion are present in the persistence of knowledge and in the maintenance of contact over distance. In this setting, the small lineage of Homo sapiens that will eventually populate the world holds. To the margins of lakes, the edges of coasts, and the scattered green corridors through arid land, their survival rests on strategies tested over generations, mobility tuned to seasonal cycles, diverse diets that draw from land and water, and social bonds that reach beyond immediate family. The record they leave is thin but consistent. Stone points, pigments, beads, hearths, and in its quiet accumulation, it tells of continuity. Through scarcity of a thread that does not break even when stretched to its limits, climate turns against them in the millennia before the Great Dispersal, reshaping the patterns of rain vegetation and migration routes that had guided generations. Around 70,000 years ago, Earth is entering a cooler phase of the late Plein, with northern ice sheets advancing and global sea levels falling by tens of meters. These distant ice masses exert a planetary influence, altering wind belts, ocean currents, and the reach of monsoon rains. In Africa, the weakening of summer monsoons means less rainfall over the interior, shrinking lakes, drying rivers, and pushing the margins of desert farther into once productive grassland. The Sahara expands, transforming from a patchwork of savanna and seasonal wetlands into a largely continuous barrier of dunes and gravel plains. Farther east, The Horn of Africa and parts of the Rift Valley face longer dry seasons, and the green corridors that link river systems begin to break apart into isolated pockets of usable land. These changes unfold on a time scale, long enough for people to adapt in place for a time, but fast enough that each generation inherits a more constrained environment than the last. Archaeological sites from this interval record the adjustments in quiet detail. Hearth layers and rock shelters thin out as periods of occupation shorten. Shell middens along coast become more important as inland resources diminish. Grinding stones show more where from processing tough seeds and underground storage organs during drought years. Seasonal movements stretch longer distances, sometimes bringing groups into marginal zones where water is uncertain and vegetation sparse. Such movements are risky but necessary, and success depends on inherited knowledge of where to find hidden springs or how to dig into dry riverbeds to reach subsurface moisture. On a planetary scale, the combination of expanding ice sheets and shifting climate zones drives a more general rearrangement of ecosystems. In Africa, montane forests contract UPS. Slope savas shift in species composition, and desert fauna expand. Their ranges, large grazing herds, once a reliable seasonal resource, become less predictable, their migrations altered by changing water availability and plant growth. Predators adjust in turn, and encounters between humans and dangerous carnivores may increase along new routes to water. The coastal margin, by contrast, offers some stability. Lower sea levels expose wide tidal flats, rich in shellfish crabs and stranded fish. Kelp forests offshore provide predictable harvests when tides and weather align. People in coastal sites make heavier use of these resources, leaving behind dense accumulations of shells and fish bones that mark periods of relative abundance amid broader scarcity. Yet, the coast is not without its own hazards. Storms can strip food sources for weeks, and saltwater intrusion into freshwater springs can render them undrinkable. Inland, the pressure of climate change on habitability can be seen in the geographic distribution of archaeological sites. In formerly well-watered areas, occupation layers vanish for centuries, suggesting abandonment as conditions became too harsh. The surviving sites often cluster near perennial springs, highland zones, with more rainfall, or along the courses of rivers that retain flow year-round. These refugia may have served as population strongholds, maintaining small groups who could survive and preserve cultural knowledge through the driest intervals. Within these refugees, technological continuity is apparent. The prepared core techniques of the Middle Stone Age persist, producing points and blades suited for both hunting and processing plant materials. Pigments remain part of the toolkit, with ochre pieces found in many contexts, some scored or ground into powder, whether used for symbolic marking high preservation or both. The regular appearance of pigments suggests that, even in difficult times, cultural practices endured alongside subsistence activities. A little-known detail from some highland sites is the presence of freshwater mollusk shells far from the lakes and rivers where they grow, implying either long-distance movement or exchange between groups occupying different ecological zones. This movement of small, non-essential items reinforces the idea of persistent social networks despite environmental fragmentation. The scientific mystery that threads through this period is how these scattered populations maintain enough connectivity to avoid complete isolation. Genetic evidence points to structured but still interlinked groups. Yet the mechanisms, occasional large gatherings, small-scale exchanges, or overlapping seasonal ranges, are largely invisible in the archaeological record. Another uncertainty is the degree to which climate stress alone drove the changes in population distribution as opposed to interactions with other hominins or shifts in disease environments. From the broad planetary perspective, these African environmental shifts are part of a global pattern. In Asia, deserts expand in central regions. In Australia, lake basins dry in sand. Dunes advance. In Europe, Steppe tundra spreads southward as forests retreat. Such synchronous change suggests that even distant ecosystems are connected by the shared forcing of ice growth and orbital variations in Earth's position relative to the Sun. For humans in Africa, this global context is invisible, but the local effects, less rain, more heat, longer trace to water, are tangible and urgent. The adaptation strategies employed in this time reflect both flexibility and conservatism. Groups exploit a broader range of foods, including smaller, harder to process plants and animals. Stone tools are made with greater efficiency, reducing waste of raw material that may now require longer journeys to obtain. Camps are placed, with more attention to defensibility and access to multiple resource zones, allowing a shift in focus if one food source fails. The patterns of mobility suggest an awareness of both seasonal cycles and longer-term trends, with groups adjusting routes over decades as certain springs fail permanently or dunes bury former grazing grounds. This shift in climate and habitability may have set the stage for eventual dispersal out of Africa. As inland routes became more difficult and coastal resources proved relatively dependable, the shoreline may have drawn people northward and eastward toward points where land came close to other continents. The lowering of sea level would end rare. Windows bring the gap at Bab el-Mandeb within sight of even modest watercraft or swimming capabilities aided by rafts and floats. Whether the people of this time were consciously moving toward new lands or simply following the path of least resistance along resource-rich coasts is unknown. But the narrowing of habitable zones within Africa created both the pressure and the possibility. It is worth noting that the climate challenges of this period were not uniform. Some regions experienced brief pulses of wetter conditions as storm tracks shifted, and these could have opened temporary green corridors across otherwise inhospitable areas. Archaeological evidence from such corridors, stone tools, hearths, and animal remains shows that people were quick to exploit these openings, moving through and perhaps establishing temporary camps before the window closed. This opportunistic mobility is a hallmark of late Plein Homo sapiens and may have been key to surviving in a climate that was on average turning harsher. By the time the larger dispersal begins, the people who will undertake it are already experts in negotiating fragmented landscapes, moving between resource patches and maintaining connections across challenging terrain. Their numbers are small, their genetic diversity reduced by earlier bottlenecks, but their capacity to adapt is well tested. The record they leave in this period, thin layers of occupation, shifting site distributions, persistent cultural markers, speaks to a quiet resilience in the face of planetary scale change. This resilience will carry them toward the narrow corridors that lead out of Africa and into the wider world. The southern route beckons in a world where falling seas reshape coasts and narrow straits become thresholds. At the southern end of the Red Sea lies Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, a strait that today spans roughly 30 kilometers. At its narrowest, but in the late Plein could contract to less than half that width when sea levels drop by more than 80 m. Exposed islands, sandbars, and reefs divide the channel into multiple passages, some only a few kilometers across. The crossing is still formidable for people without sails or metal tools, yet not unimaginable for coastal groups accustomed to exploiting tidal flats, maneuvering logs or bundles of reeds in shallow waters and timing movements to predictable tidal flows. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that one major wave of humans leaving Africa between 60 and 70,000 years ago likely used the southern route, moving from the Horn of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. The idea is supported by finds at coastal and near coastal sites on both sides of the strait that share tool types, raw materials, and in some cases pigment use. Consistent with Middle Stone Age traditions in Eastern Africa, the geographic pull of Bab el-Mandeb is reinforced by the conditions on either side. On the African shore, the southern Red Sea coast offers stretches of productive shallows, mangroves, and Shellfish beds. Inland highlands intercept seasonal rains feeding springs that provide reliable fresh water even in drier years. On the Arabian side, the Tama coastal plain widens during low seans, revealing broad intertidal zones and seasonal streams from the Aesir Mountains. These environments could sustain small bands for extended periods, especially if supplemented by foraging inland during wetter months. The little-known detail is that some of the stone raw materials found on the Arabian side match sources in Africa, suggesting not only that people crossed, but that they carried or traded valued toolstone from familiar territories. Whether these were transported by the migrants themselves or obtained through exchange with groups already in Arabia remains uncertain. The scientific mystery is how deliberate these first crossings were. Some researchers propose that small groups could have been swept across accidentally during storms while working near offshore islands or fishing grounds, arriving on the opposite shore by chance, and then deciding to remain. Others argue for planned crossings, pointing to the consistent presence of African lithic traditions in early Arabian sites as evidence of intentional movement by whole groups carrying their technology and culture intact. The archaeological record does not resolve intent. It records only presence leaving, motive in the realm of inference. From a planetary scale perspective, this crossing is a local expression of global processes. Glacial growth in the high latitudes locks away ocean water, lowering shorelines and changing the geometry of continents. Narrow straits worldwide contract. Island chains lengthen as submerged ridges emerge and shallow seas expose. Continental shelves that become new landscapes. The Bab el-Mandeb in low sea stands as part of this larger transformation, just as the Bering Strait in the far north will one day become a land bridge. For the people of this moment, these changes are experienced not as a map, but as a sequence of practical opportunities and hazards. A reef now reachable on foot. At extreme low tide, a channel where currents are weaker than before, a distant island that seems closer on the horizon. The approach to the strait from the African side may have been gradual, shaped by seasonal foraging patterns along the coast. As groups moved north and east, they would have found new shellfish beds, fishing spots, and freshwater seeps, each encouraging a little more exploration. The final step to Arabia could have been the culmination of years of familiarity with the channels and islands, reducing the psychological distance of the crossing. The toolkit they carried was adaptable points and blades suitable for both hunting and processing marine resources, scrapers for hides, and grinding stones for plants. Fire remained central not only for cooking and warmth, but also for maintaining a measure of independence from the environment, allowing occupation of windy or exposed shores, where shelter was limited. Pigments too seem to have traveled, perhaps as part of personal ornamentation or group identity markers, serving to maintain social cohesion during the uncertainties of movement into new territory. On the Arabian side, early camps likely clustered near both marine and freshwater resources. The Tama Plain in low sea conditions would have been far wider than today, with braided streams, marshes, and areas of light vegetation. Inland mountains provided seasonal rainfall and potentially served as landmarks for navigation. From these bases, groups could forage along the coast and venture inland to hunt or collect plants returning before water supplies dwindled. This mix of coastal and interior use mirrors patterns seen on the African side and would have supported a relatively seamless transition. The broader implications of this crossing are visible in genetic data. All non-African human populations today share ancestry from a subset of Africans who lived during this period, and the southern route is one of the most plausible pathways for that expansion. The small size of the founding population magnifies the effects of genetic drift, creating a legacy of reduced diversity outside Africa that persists despite tens of thousands of years of subsequent growth and mixing. The archaeological visibility of the first migrants is faint. Sites are often ephemeral scatters of tools, hearths, and shell mittens, many of which are now submerged beneath post-glacial seas. This submergence is another reminder of the planetary forces at play. The same, falling seas that expose a route into Arabia later reverse course as ice. Sheets melted, drowning much of the evidence of those early coastal lives. What survives is partial and often inland, representing camps away from the shifting tidal zones. The question of timing remains a matter of active research. Some sites in Arabia dated to more than 100,000 years ago suggest earlier, perhaps failed expansions of Homo sapiens into the peninsula, likely during wetter periods when the interior was more hospitable. The 60 to 70,000 year window, however, correspond with a dispersal that led to lasting, global settlement, and the southern route is a corridor most often linked to that success. Whether earlier groups contributed genetically to later ones or whether they were replaced entirely is a question the evidence cannot yet answer. As the crossing is made, whether in a single generation or through a slow drift of camps from one shore to the other, the cultural package of Middle Stone Age Africa arrives in Arabia intact. This includes not only tools and pigments, but also the social knowledge of movement cooperation and adaptation to varied environments. The people stepping onto Arabian soil are not fundamentally different from those who remain in Africa, but their trajectory will carry them into landscapes, climates, and encounters unknown to their ancestors. In the present tense of the story, the moment is unmarked by ceremony or announcement. A group lands on a beach, pulls up a log or bundle of reeds to dry tins of fire, and begins to gather shellfish. Behind them lies a sea channel crossed perhaps more than once before. Ahead lies a coastal plain stretching toward mountains, and beyond a continent that will lead them step by step to the edges of the known world. The crossing itself is just one link in, a chain of movements driven by the quiet interplay of climate resource distribution and human adaptability. Yet, in its consequences, it marks the threshold between the African homeland of Homo sapiens and the vast territories that will become home to their descendants. Coastal lifeline is a thread that sustains these first groups. As they edge farther from familiar African shores into the expanse of the Arabian Peninsula, the shoreline in a time of lowered seas is a wide shifting interface of tidal flats, mangroves, lagoons, and reefs, each offering reliable of seasonal resources. Shellfish can be gathered by hand fish, trapped in tidal pools, crabs collected under rocks, and seaweed harvested during low tides. Offshore shallows teem with life, their productivity enhanced by nutrient-rich currents, while exposed reefs offer both food and navigational reference. These coastal environments are predictable in their cycles, even if individual days vary with weather and tide, and they provide a foundation of calories in a broader landscape where inland resources may be uncertain or scarce. Archaeological evidence from other parts of the world shows that coastal foraging traditions can be remarkably stable over thousands of years, and it is likely that these early migrants carried such practices with them as part of their adaptive repertoire. The little-known detail is that at some early Arabian sites, the ratio of marine to terrestrial remains suggests a heavy reliance on shellfish and fish, indicating that groups were not simply passing along the coast, but actively structuring their subsistence around it. This reliance may also have freed them from some of the constraints faced by inland groups, such as competition for grazing herds or the need to find fresh water in aid zones. Though fresh water remained essential and had to be sourced from spring seeps or collected rainwater along the southern and eastern Arabian coasts, fresh water could be found in scattered places, sometimes in seasonal pools that persisted in shaded depressions, sometimes in seeps at the base of cliffs where groundwater emerged. Knowledge of these points would have been critical and may have been shared through social networks or learned through exploration. Coastal travel offered another advantage orientation. The unbroken line of the shore, coupled with the predictable position of the sun and the stars, allowed navigation over long distances without the need for landmarks deep inland. People could move from one resource patch to another, timing their arrivals to coincide with optimal gathering conditions and maintain a mental map of the coastline that extended beyond the horizon. From a planetary perspective, these coasts were reshaped by the same glacial cycles that lowered the seas. Tidal zones extended far outward. Barrier islands formed where sandbars caught vegetation. Lagoons shifted with each storm season. Many of these features now submerged would have offered temporary campsites or foraging grounds in the late Plein. The archaeological visibility of such sites today is limited as post-glacial. Sea drowned them, but the pattern inferred from surviving inland sites suggests a rhythm of occupation tied to the tides and seasons. The mystery that remains is whether the reliance on coastal resources was a deliberate long-term strategy for dispersal or a temporary adaptation to specific environmental conditions. Some researchers argue that the coast acted as a corridor allowing rapid movement into South Asia and beyond, while others see it as a patchwork route where movement was slower and punctuated by periods of settlement and inland foray. The available evidence cannot resolve the speed or continuity of travel, but it does point to a repeated and skilled use of marine resources wherever coastlines were accessible. Inland excursions remained important, especially for securing materials not available on the shore. Stone for tools often came from outcrops some distance from the coast, and plant foods from inland valleys could supplement marine diets. These trips would have been planned to minimize risk with knowledge of water sources along the route and an awareness of seasonal changes in plant availability. Some inland routes may have followed ephemeral rivers that flowed during brief wet seasons, offering both water and a corridor of vegetation in otherwise arid land. The stone tools found along the Arabian coast in this period show continuity with African Middle Stone Age traditions prepared core techniques, points and scrapers, indicating that cultural knowledge persisted even as environments changed. Pigments appear sporadically, suggesting that symbolic or practical uses of color continued, though perhaps in reduced quantities, if suitable minerals were scarce locally. The recurrence of certain tool forms over large areas implies either direct movement of groups or exchange between coastal bands, maintaining technological similarity across distances. Coastal living also required adaptations to new hazards. Storm surges could flood campsites. Shifting sands might bury food caches. High winds could damage shelters. Fire had to be protected from salt-laden air and sudden squalls. Yet the benefits of predictable, renewable resources outweighed these challenges, especially when inland conditions were unpredictable. In times of drought, the coast might be the only consistently productive zone, sustaining groups through lean seasons. The broader climate context continued to influence these choices. The Arabian interior during glacial periods was generally more arid than at present, with limited green corridors. Monsoon rains occasionally pushed farther north, briefly opening routes into the heart of the peninsula, but such intervals were short-lived. For most of the dispersal period, the coast was a Shia's path, and the lifeline it provided was as much about connectivity as about subsistence. Following the coast eastward would eventually lead to the mouths of great rivers, such as the Indies, where freshwater and fertile floodplains expanded resource possibilities. The speed of this movement is still debated. Some genetic models suggest that humans reached Southeast Asia within a few thousand years of leaving Africa, implying relatively fast travel along the coast. Others, based on archaeological gaps, propose slower progression with long stops. Either way, the coast remains central to survival during the journey. The use of coastal resources has analogs in other Plein dispersals, such as the movement into Sahul, the combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea, where crossing Wallach's islands require marine knowledge. It is plausible that the skills honed along the Arabian and South Asian coasts, reading tides, handling watercraft, exploiting intertidal zones, contributed directly to later successful crossings into new continents. Today, much of the physical evidence for these early Coastal adaptations lies beneath the waves, erased by the post-glacial sea level rise of more than 100 m. What remains are inland traces, stone tools, and now arid valleys that once led to the shore shell beads far from the sea, and the genetic legacy of small populations who followed the edge of the land into the wider world. In the live present story, the coast is neither a grand strategy nor a conscious bridge to distant lands. It is the everyday path of least resistance, the line where food and water are most likely to be found, the route that can be followed without losing one's way. Fires burn in the lee of dunes, shellfish roast on embers, fish are split and laid on racks to dry in the sun. Children play in the shallows, learning by imitation which shells to collect and which to avoid. Elders remember the sequence of inlets, reefs, and headlands, and that knowledge passed quietly ensures that the group can always find its way to the next safe place in the steady progression along the shifting boundary of land and sea. The coastal lifeline carries them forward step by deliberate step into landscapes no one they have known has ever seen. Through the arid gateways lies the next test for these dispersing groups where the dependable rhythm of coastal foraging must bend to the demands of dry interior corridors. The Arabian Peninsula's heart is dominated by expanses of gravel, plain dune fields and barren plateaus broken only by scattered mountains and ephemeral riverbeds. In glacial times, much of this interior is hyper-arid with vegetation limited to drought-tolerant shrubs and isolated groves and wadis where rare rains collect. To cross these aid gateways requires precise timing, detailed knowledge of water sources, and the ability to carry both food and fuel over long distances. The archaeological visibility of such movements is slight fleeting scatters of stone flakes, a hearth ring beside a now dry seep, an abandoned core lying half buried in wind-blown sand. Yet these traces, faint as they are, mark the edges of the routes that linked coast to highland refuges and inland valleys. The little-known detail from sediment cores taken in some Arabian basins is the presence of fine-grained pollen from weather-adapted plants dating to brief intervals during this period, suggesting that for a few centuries at a time rainfall may have been sufficient to sustain grass in shallow lakes far inland. Such windows would have opened green corridors to the otherwise forbidding interior, allowing groups to move between resource zones without the risks inherent in long desert crossings. The challenge was that these windows could close quickly on a human timescale. Within a few generations, a passable route might return to dust and heat. The scientific mystery is how often people attempted crossings in suboptimal conditions, perhaps driven by necessity when coastal or highland resources failed. Did they prepare caches along the route, leaving food or water in shaded places for future use? Did they know of and exploit the migration of game animals between the coast and interior following herds that knew where to find the rare pools? The record offers no direct answers, only the suggestion from tool distribution patterns that people ventured deep inland more than once, even during dry periods. From a planetary perspective, these arid gateways are part of the global redistribution of climate zones under the influence of ice sheets and orbital cycles. As high-latitude ice grows, the subtropical dry belts intensify and regions like the Arabian interior become more extreme in their aridity. Wind systems strengthen driving sand dunes farther into former steppe and dust. Storms lift material high into the atmosphere, some of which will settle thousands of kilometers away. These changes, driven by forces far beyond human perception, manifest locally as a water hole that dries sooner. Each year, a patch of grass that fails to sprout in a valley floor, a once predictable herd that no longer arrives. The response of late Plein humans to these changes is adaptive rather than defiant. Inland forays are planned for specific goals, obtaining raw materials, reaching a known freshwater spring, intercepting animal migrations, and are abandoned when risks outweigh gains. Coastal camps act as bases from which small parties set out carrying portable toolkits, and knowledge of where in the shifting landscape relief can be found. The stone tools found along these inland margins sometimes show heavier retouch, and reuse in coastal equivalents evidence that raw material was scarce and had to be conserved. In some cases, exotic stone types appear in these arid zones, their sources lying hundreds of kilometers away. This suggests that either the tool stone was carried from distant regions or that the people themselves were part of a chain of exchanges spanning great distances. The role of highlands in these movements is crucial. In southwestern Arabia, the Aesir and Yemen highlands capture moisture from seasonal winds, creating belts of woodland and grass that persist even in dry phases. These highlands could serve as staging points for inland travel or as refuges during coastal scarcity. Archaeological sites in such zones often contain a mixture of coastal and inland resources, pointing to a flexible pattern of movement between environments. Inland water sources range from large, persistent springs to small seasonal pools in shaded ravines. Knowing their locations and seasonal reliability would be essential, and this knowledge likely moved with people carried in memory and perhaps in the form of subtle landscape markers. Animal bones found at some interior sites hint that human presence here was tied to the availability of game gazelle, onager, and smaller mammal species that could be hunted for both meat and hides. These hunts, however, required balancing energy costs against returns, especially in environments where a failed hunt could mean a long, dangerous walk back to water. The larger dispersal narrative sees these aid gateways not as permanent homes, but as filter zones that could be crossed only under favorable conditions, and that shaped the pathways of human movement. When wetter phases arrived, they opened new possibilities for exploration and contact. When dryness returned, they closed off regions and reinforced reliance on the coast. This dynamic meant that the dispersal was not a single unbroken push forward, but a sequence of advances, pauses, and sometimes retreats. In the broader context of global human expansion, such arid gateways appear in many regions. The deserts of Central Asia, the Saharan barrier in Africa, the Australian interior. In each case, humans either skirted the edges or found ways to cross during rare favorable intervals. The Arabian example is notable for its position between Africa and Eurasia, making it a decisive stage in the route from the African homeland to the rest of the world. The question of whether some groups became stranded in these arid interiors is unresolved. Fossil and tool evidence is sparse, and without organic preservation, it is difficult to know whether occupation lasted for seasons, decades, or centuries. It is possible that some populations adapted to inland life for extended periods, developing localized patterns of subsistence only to vanish when the climate shifted against them. If so, they may have left faint genetic or cultural traces in later populations, though the signals would be hard to distinguish. For those who pass successfully through the aid gateways, reinforce skills that will be vital in other challenging environments: water management, long distanciance planning, and the ability to move flexibly between ecological zones. The movement through these dry corridors was not an epic dash, but a patient threading of known points, guided by knowledge as much as by necessity. In the lived moment of the journey, the interior crossing is quiet, marked by days of walking across open gravel under hard light nights spent near a low fire in the shelter of a dune or rock wall. Mornings when the horizon is scanned for the shimmer of distant vegetation that means water. The tools are kept close, repaired with care. The fire is shielded from wind. The path is chosen to balance directness, with the certainty of reaching the next spring. When the coast appears again on the far side, it is not greeted as the end of hardship, but as the next phase in a long, continuous adaptation to the varied and shifting landscapes that stretch ahead. These arid gateways with their risks and rewards are both obstacles and teachers, shaping the dispersal not only in direction but in the resilience of the people who undertake it across the peninsula. The dispersal continues, threading between environments that alternate from harsh to briefly generous. Under the influence of shifting monsoon patterns, the Arabian interior is not uniformly barren. During certain climatic phases, summer monsoons extend their reach farther north, feeding seasonal rivers and ephemeral lakes. These wetter intervals may last decades or centuries, carving green corridors across what is otherwise a forbidding landscape. Pollen records from ancient lake beds show traces of grasses, sedges, and even small stands of trees during these windows, while Fondo remains suggests herds of gazelle wild. Cattle and other grazers move through in large numbers, drawing predators and humans alike. For dispersing Homo sapiens, these green pulses are both opportunity and challenge. They allow inland routes that bypass long stretches of coast, shorten travel distances, and open new foraging grounds. Yet they also require precise awareness of timing. A route passable in one generation might close in the next as rainfall patterns shift southward. Again, archaeological traces in these interior corridors are scattered but telling. At some ancient lake basins, stone tools lie embedded in the silt points, scrapers and blades shaped with prepared core methods recognizable from African, Middle Stone Age traditions. In certain cases, the stone used is not local, indicating movement of either people or goods across considerable distances. Hearts with charred seeds suggest that plant foods supplement hunting, and occasional pigment fragments point to continuity in symbolic or practical coloring practices even far from the coast. The little-known detail is that some tools found in these interior settings have residues of aquatic plants, implying that humans exploited shallow lakes and marshes not only for drinking water, but also for edible tubers and stems, a resource that would have been seasonal but predictable. The scientific mystery is how far these inland foray extended during wet phases, whether they connected directly to other regions such as Mesopotamia or the Levant, or whether they formed enclosed circuits that were abandoned as climates dried. The gaps in the record make it difficult to trace continuous paths, leaving open the question of whether dispersal in this phase was a steady expansion or a series of isolated advances and retreats. On the planetary scale, these oscillations in Arabian climate reflect the interplay of glacial cycles, monsoon, strength, and the position of the intertropical convergence zone. When northern ice sheets grow global atmospheric circulation, shifts weakening African and Asian monsoons. When they retreat slightly, the monsoons strengthen, bringing rain farther. Inland, these shifts happen on time scales of thousands of years, but can be felt locally in less than a human lifetime as springs flow more strongly, or fade as lakes fill, and recede as animal migrations adjust the spread, or contraction of vegetation. Humans in this setting are not merely passive observers. They track the return of seasonal rains, plan movements around animal migrations, and adjust camp locations to take advantage of newly productive areas. Inland routes may become the focus of seasonal gatherings where groups meet to exchange materials, mates, and information. Such gatherings could reinforce genetic diversity and cultural continuity across widely spaced populations, critical for long-term survival in a small founding population. Coastal links remain important, acting as fallback zones when interior conditions worsen. In some cases, archaeological sites suggest alternating occupations between coastal and inland locations, possibly reflecting a seasonal round in which people spent part of the year exploiting marine resources and part of the year following inland herds and plant harvests. This flexibility in mobility patterns would have allowed dispersing groups to explore new territories without severing ties to reliable food sources. The stone technology of this phase remains consistent with African origins, but shows signs of adaptation to new raw materials and uses. In regions where fine-grained stone is scarce, coarser materials are worked into larger, more robust tools, while in areas near river gravels, smaller, more precise flakes are produced. Tool kits seem to balance hunting needs with processing of plant foods and hides, and The presence of grinding stones and some interior contacts suggests that plant processing was a significant part of subsistence even far from the coast. Water remains a critical limiting factor. The knowledge of spring seeps and temporary lakes would have been preserved and transmitted carefully, perhaps through oral traditions tied to landmarks, seasonal rivers. This could be followed to reach interior basins, but their flows were unreliable and travel along them required readiness for both sudden floods and extended dry spells. The capacity to store water, whether in natural depressions, perishable containers, or by carrying an animal, skins, would have been vital for longer crossings. From a genetic perspective, these inland phases may have facilitated contact with other human populations, already present in parts of Eurasia, though the strongest evidence for such encounters comes later in the dispersal. If such contact occurred, it could have introduced new genetic lineages into the expanding Homo sapiens population, though in the small numbers characteristic of early dispersals, even limited admixture could have lasting impact. The mystery of how these routes intersected with those of Neanderthals and Denisovans remains partly unsolved as archaeological evidence in Arabia 4. Direct contact is lacking, but the timing suggests that eventual encounters further north or east were likely. Planetary processes continue to shape the possibilities. As glacial ice waxed and waned, sea levels rose and fell, altering the accessibility of coastal shelves and the size of inland lakes. Dust transport from expanding deserts affected distant climates and ecosystems, contributing to feedback loops that influence monsoon strength. In Arabia, these changes dictated when and where dispersing humans could move inland and when they had to retreat to the margins. The lived reality of crossing the peninsula during a green phase would have been unlike the slow edging along a coastal lifeline. Here, movement could be faster. Camps could be set near lake, shores with abundant plant and animal life, and groups could gather in larger numbers. The abundance, though temporary, may have allowed population growth, which in turn could fuel further dispersal. Yet the knowledge that such abundance might end within a lifetime would have been part of planning, keeping mobility and adaptability at the core of survival. When conditions turn again toward aridity, the pathways would shrink, lakes would evaporate, and grasslands would revert to dust. Those who had traveled inland might return to the coast, carrying with them information about the terrain, the resources, and perhaps the presence of other human groups. Over generations, these cycles of inland expansion and coastal fallback will weave together a mental map of the peninsula, its rhythms, and its possibilities. In the broader scope of the dispersal crossing, the peninsula, through these temporary corridors, brought Homo sapiens into position for further expansion toward the Fertile Crescent, Iran, and South Asia, whether by hugging the southern coast or venturing inland when conditions allowed. The movement was cumulative each season's travel, adding to the range and reach of the population. In the present tense of journey, however, it is a matter of days and weeks, walking along a riverbed toward a distant green patch, hearing the calls of water birds that signal a lake ahead, finding fresh tracks of grazing animals on damp soil, and making camp where reeds whisper in the wind. The peninsula is not yet a barrier or a passageway in the abstract. It is simply the land ahead to be known step by step, season by season as the dispersal unfolds. Meeting the distant cousins occurs as dispersing. Homo sapiens reach the northern edge of the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, where ecological zones widen and climate shift with latitude. Here, temperate woodlands, open grasslands, and seasonal rivers provide more varied resources than the arid corridors behind them. Yet these landscapes are already home to other humans, Neanderthals, who have lived in Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Archaeological sites from the Levant show alternating occupations by Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens over tens of millennia, suggesting that these regions acted as borderlands where populations could replace or overlap with one another depending on climate and resource availability. The The meeting of these lineages is written most clearly in the genetic record. Modern non-African humans carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA evidence of interbreeding that likely occurred soon after leaving Africa, possibly in or near the Levant. This genetic contribution is not uniform. Different populations show different Neanderthal segments, implying multiple episodes of contact in different places and times. The little known detail is that some of these introgressed genes appear to be linked to immune system function, potentially aiding adaptation to new pathogens encountered outside Africa. The scientific mystery lies in the nature of these encounters. Were they brief and rare, occurring only when ranges overlap during favorable climate? Phases are more sustained in certain areas where resources could support mixed communities. Archaeological evidence alone cannot resolve the social context of contact. Tool assemblages from this time in the Levant sometimes blend traits associated with both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. Traditions, raising questions about cultural exchange or parallel adaptation to similar environments. From a planetary scale perspective, this region sits at the junction of continents shaped by both African and Eurasian climate systems. During glacial periods, cooler and drier conditions in the Levant could push both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens southward, concentrating populations in the more hospitable refugia along coasts and river valleys. In interglacial or wetter phases, grasslands and woodlands expanded, opening corridors toward Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. These oscillations could repeatedly bring different human populations into proximity. The dispersing Homo sapiens arrive here with toolkits refined in Africa, but adaptable to local materials. Prepared core flakes for cutting points, for hunting scrapers for hide processing, and grinding stones where plant foods are abundant. Pigments still appear in some sites, suggesting that symbolic practices continue even amid the demands of new landscapes. Hunting strategies adapt to the mix of prey available: red deer, wild cattle, equids, and in some cases, smaller game like hares or birds. Rivers and lakes yield fish and water, fowl diversifying diets beyond what many Neanderthal populations may have relied on. The archaeological record from caves, such as those at Coffin School in Israel, provides glimpses of early Homo sapiens in the Levant over 100,000 years ago, suggesting that dispersals into this region occurred multiple times, some perhaps failing or retreating back into Africa. The successful dispersal associated with the later expansion out of Africa likely encountered Neanderthals already well adapted to the region. The presence of similar prey species and overlapping tool types raises a possibility that knowledge of local hunting grounds or seasonal patterns could have been shared or contested between the groups. Inland, the terrain offers routes north, into Anatolia, and east toward the Zagros Mountains. Each pathway holds potential for further encounters with other human populations, including the Denisovans. Farther east, genetic evidence suggests that by the time Homo sapiens reached Eastern Asia, they had already acquired DNA from both Neanderthals and Denisovans, pointing to multiple contact zones across Eurasia. The Levant is thus one of the earliest known points on this wider map of interactions. The role of climate in shaping these meetings is critical. When wetter conditions prevail, forest belts extend northward, and both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may range more widely, reducing the likelihood of concentrated encounters. During drier phases, resources contract and populations may be forced into closer proximity along coasts and river valleys. Such concentration could increase the chance of both cooperation and conflict, though the evidence available cannot speak to the frequency or nature of either. From a survival perspective, dispersing Homo sapiens likely benefited from contact in at least two ways. First, genetic exchange could provide adaptive traits for local environments. Second, knowledge exchange, whether through direct teaching, imitation, or simply observation, could speed adaptation to unfamiliar climates, prey, and seasonal cycles. The archaeological blending of tool traditions could reflect such exchanges, though disentangling cultural influence from. Independent innovation remains a challenge. The mystery of how these early meetings shaped later dispersals is partly genetic and partly cultural. The introgression of Neanderthal DNA into all non-African humans suggests that the encounters were not isolated. They left a permanent mark on the lineage. Cultural influences are harder to trace, but the capacity to integrate new ideas and technologies may have been as important as genetic benefits in enabling rapid expansion into diverse environments. The planetary backdrop to this meeting includes not only shifting climate zones, but also tectonic and sea level changes. Lower seas in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf region would have made earlier stages of the journey possible, while in the Levant, lowered Mediterranean levels expose wider coastal plains, potentially altering settlement patterns for both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. These environmental changes will continue to influence the ebb and flow contact zones for thousands of years. In the lived present of the dispersal, the meeting of distant cousins is not recognized as a historical milestone. It is simply the arrival of other humans in the landscape, individuals with different faces, perhaps different voices using tools that are both familiar and strange. Camps may be within sight of one another for a season where signs of occupation may be found along a trail, a distinctive spear point, a hearth with bones of animals hunted differently, footprints in mud. The responses to such signs, avoidance, cautious approach, or direct meeting would shape the immediate possibilities for survival and movement. Over time, as groups move onward into new territories, the genetic and cultural echoes of these meetings travel, with them embedded in their bodies and habits. The dispersal continues shaped, not only by climate and geography, but now also by the shared legacy of contact between lineages that once evolved apart and now find themselves in the same narrowing world. Highlands and cold winds greet the dispersing Homo sapiens as they press farther into Eurasia, leaving the relatively temperate Levant behind and entering the upland plateaus and steppe corridors of Central Asia. The landscapes here are vast and open, marked by rolling grasslands, sparse stand of hardy trees, and river valleys that snake between low mountain ranges. Winters are long with temperatures well below freezing, and summers can be hot and dry, creating a climate of extremes unfamiliar to groups whose ancestral homeland lay in equatorial and subtropical Africa. The first challenge in these upland zones is temperature regulation and shelter. Archaeological evidence from later periods suggests that humans adapted to cold environments through layered clothing, well-insulated shelters, and a careful placement of camps to avoid wind exposure. While direct evidence for clothing from this early stage is absent due to poor preservation, indirect clues such as the increased use of hide scrapers and bones hint that garments and coverings were more substantial than in warmer regions. Fire becomes even more central, not only for cooking and warmth, but also for preserving food through smoking or drying, ensuring supplies for periods when hunting or gathering is limited by snow cover. The little-known detail is that isotopic studies of animal bones from steppe environments during this time show seasonal migrations of large herbivores like horse bison and saiga antelope. These migrations would have been predictable and could be tracked across hundreds of kilometers, providing opportunities for intercept hunting at choke points such as river crossings or narrow valleys. To exploit these cycles, Homo sapiens needed to adjust their mobility patterns, planning movements not only by plant seasons, but also by the rhythms of game animals. The scientific mystery in this setting is the speed with which early dispersers adapted to these highly seasonal environments. Did they acquire critical survival knowledge from Neanderthal or Denisovan populations already established in these latitudes? Or did they develop these adaptations independently through experimentation and observation? The archaeological record offers hints, toolkits with features from both African and local Eurasian traditions, but cannot fully reveal the transmission pathways. From a planetary perspective, The Central Asian steppes are part of the great mid-latitude belt of grassland that stretches across Eurasia. During glacial periods, these grasslands expand, linking regions from eastern Europe to Mongolia and forming a continuous corridor for both humans and animals. This corridor is not uniform. It is broken by mountain ranges such as the Kawasus, the Pomers, and the Tian Shan, whose passes act as both routes and barriers depending on the season. Glacial climate oscillations influence the productivity of the steppe, with colder phases supporting hardy grazing species but limiting tree cover and water availability for dispersing Homo sapiens. The upland plateaus present both opportunities and hazards. Game is abundant in certain seasons, and visibility across open terrain allows for long-distance detection of herds and predators alike. Yet exposure to wind, scarcity of fuel wood, and the risk of being caught far from shelter in sudden storms demand a new level of logistical planning. Rivers become lifelines, providing water concentrations of game and, in some cases, driftwood for fuel. These waterways also serve as natural corridors for movement, guiding groups through otherwise featureless plains. Tool technology in these regions often incorporates locally available stone, sometimes transported from considerable distances, suggesting that specific raw material sources were known and revisited. The preparation of large elongated blades becomes more common, possibly reflecting the need for versatile cutting edges in processing large animals and heavy hides. Bone and antler tools begin to appear more frequently, their durability and workability making them useful for specialized tasks such as sewing or shaping wooden implements. Pigments are less common in the archaeological record here than in warmer zones, but their occasional presence suggests that symbolic or functional uses persisted despite the harsher environment. The adaptation to cold also involves changes in food, storage and preservation. Smoking and drying meat in cold, dry air would have extended the shelf life of large kills, allowing for more efficient use of hunting effort. Fat-rich animals become particularly valuable, as fat is a critical energy source in cold climates. The ability to target such species and process them effectively could make the difference between survival and hardship. Encounters with other hominins remain possible in these highland and steppe environments. Denisovans known from genetic evidence and a handful of fossil remains in Siberia may have inhabited parts of Central Asia during this time, and genetic integration from them is found in some modern human populations, especially in Oceania and parts of Asia. The location and nature of these interactions remain a mystery, but the movement of Homo sapiens into highland corridors increases the likelihood of contact. Climatic variability continues to shape movement choices during milder interstadial periods. Plant growth and animal abundance increase, encouraging exploration and expansion into new valleys and plateaus. Colder stadials contract habitable zones, forcing groups to concentrate in sheltered basins or along resource-rich rivers. This ebb and flow likely led to cyclical patterns of occupation in many upland regions, with sites used intensively during favorable phases and abandoned when conditions deteriorated. From a survival standpoint, learning to anticipate these shifts would be as important as adapting to the cold itself. The knowledge gained here, how to move with herds, locate winter shelter, and maintain warmth, would be crucial for later expansions into even colder territories, such as Ice Age Europe. In the lived present of dispersal, the highlands and cold winds are not abstract environmental challenges, but daily realities. Breath condensing in the air during early morning hunts, snow crunching underfoot on long walks between valleys, the constant attention to wind direction when setting camp. Nights are spent close to the fire tools laid out within reach, hides stretched on frames to dry. The stars are sharper in the thin air, and their familiar patterns unchanged. Since Africa provides continuity in a landscape that demands new skills at every step, these upland zones, with their open vistas and hard seasons, test the adaptability of the dispersing Homo sapiens. Those who succeed here carry forward not only their genetic lineage, but also a growing body of environmental knowledge, a capacity for planning, and the resilience to thrive in climates far removed from their origins. As they push onward, this experience becomes a foundation for entering still more varied and challenging environments, carrying the dispersal deeper into the vastness of Eurasia. Footprints in the southeast appear as Homo sapiens move beyond Central and South Asia into the humid tropics, where the coasts of Southeast Asia and the islands of the Sunda Shelf present a radically different environment from the dry uplands and steppe they have traversed. Sea levels remain far lower than today, exposing vast tracts of land that link present-day Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and the Asian mainland into a single connected landmass. Dense forests cover much of this region, broken by rivers, mangrove-lined estuaries, and coastal plains rich in fish and shellfish. The tropical climate is warm and humid year-round, with monsoon rains feeding a mosaic of wetlands, floodplains, and evergreen forest. The archaeological evidence of early human presence here includes stone tools found along ancient river terraces, shell mittens on now submerged coastal plains, and in some cases human skeletal remains dating to shortly after the out of Africa dispersal window. These remains often exhibit a combination of features suggesting adaptation to varied environments, from robust bones suited for long distance walking to evidence of dietary diversity. The little-known detail is that some sites in northern Australia contain stone artifacts dated to more than 60,000 years ago, implying that humans moved through Southeast Asia relatively quickly after leaving Africa, perhaps in only a few thousand years. This rapid passage, if correct, suggests mastery of coastal navigation and foraging strategies that could sustain movement over long distances with minimal delay. The scientific mystery is the exact route taken through this region. 2. Primary corridors are debated, one hugging the coastline of the Indian Ocean through the Bay of Bengal and down the Malay Peninsula, the other crossing inland river valleys of the subcontinent and emerging onto the exposed Sunda Shelf via overland routes. Both paths may have been used, and their choice likely depended on local conditions, resource availability, and seasonal weather patterns. From a planetary perspective, the Sunda Shelf is part of a broader pattern of lowered sea levels during glacial periods when continental shelves around the world became habitable land. These regions, rich in marine and estuarine resources, would have been focal points for human settlement and movement. In Southeast Asia, the exposed shelf formed a bridge to the islands and ultimately to Sahul, the combined Ice Age landmass of Australia and New Guinea. For dispersing Homo sapiens, the coastal route through this region offered consistent resources, but required adaptation to tropical conditions. High humidity affected the preservation of food and tools. Wood and plant fibers decayed quickly, leaving little trace in the archaeological record. Stone tools were made from locally available materials, often coarse grain, stone shaped into flakes, and choppers suitable for cutting plants, processing shellfish, and butchering fish or small game. Some sites yield evidence of specialized shell work, suggesting that marine exploitation was not only subsistence-based, but also possibly involved symbolic or decorative use. Inland excursions into the forest demanded different skills from the open, steppe or savanna. Dense canopy reduced visibility and made long-distance tracking more difficult, but the diversity of plant and animal life offer opportunities for foraging. Roots, tubers, fruits, and small animals could be collected year-round, though knowledge of edible versus toxic species was crucial. Rivers served as both travel routes and food sources, with fish, turtles, and crocodiles adding to the diet. The interplay between coast and forest and mobility patterns likely varied seasonally, with groups spending part of the year near the shore to exploit fish runs and shellfish beds, and part inland to gather forest products and hunt. Encounters with other hominins may have occurred here as well. Fossil evidence suggests that Homo erectus persisted on Java until at least 100,000 years ago, raising the possibility that early Homo sapiens reached Southeast Asia, while other human species still lived in parts of the region. No definitive evidence of direct contact has been found, but the overlap in time and geography keeps the question open. The potential for interaction with Denisovans also exists, as genetic evidence points to significant Denisovan ancestry in later populations of Oceania, implying contact somewhere between South Asia and Sahul. Navigating the waterways and coastal zones of the Sunda Shelf would have required not only physical movement, but also the transfer of knowledge about tides, currents, and seasonal weather. Even without large permanent boats, people could have used rafts, dugout canoes, or other simple craft to cross rivers and narrow straits between islands, especially during periods of low sea level when distances between land masses were shorter. The use of fire in these tropical zones may have had additional functions, including clearing undergrowth to ease travel, encouraging the growth of certain plants, and deterring dangerous animals, such as snakes or large cats. Fire also played a role in processing plant foods that were otherwise inedible, such as starchy roots that required roasting to neutralize toxins. On the planetary scale, the rapid expansion into Southeast Asia illustrates the capacity of Homo sapiens to adapt to vastly different climates and ecosystems within only a few thousand years. The same lineage that had survived arid corridors, cold highlands, and temperate woodlands now thrived in humid tropical coasts and forests. This versatility is a hallmark of the species and one of the keys to its eventual global spread. The lived present of the dispersal here is defined by movement through an environment alive with sound and color, the calls of birds and primates in the forest canopy, the roar of surf on exposed coastal flats, the hum of insects in the humid air. Camps are set near rivers where fresh water and fish are abundant or on ridges above the tide, lying where breezes keep insects at bay. Shells are cracked open on flat stones. Fish are smoked over slow fires, and plant fibers are stripped and twisted into cord. Navigation follows both the coastline and the courses of rivers. Inland with mental maps linking fishing grounds, foraging zones, and seasonal camps. As groups move through the Sunda Shelf, they leave behind footprints in mud that harden and survive, bones and tools buried in flood deposits, and the genetic traces that will be carried into the first human populations of Sahul. This stage of the journey is both a passage and a destination, a region rich enough to sustain long-term settlement, but positioned as a stepping stone to the next great leap. The path ahead will require crossing water to reach lands that have never known human presence, but the knowledge and skills gained here in reading coastlines, harvesting marine resources, and adapting to new ecologies will make that leap possible. Crossing to Sahul is the most significant maritime step in the first great dispersal, a passage that marks the arrival of Homo sapiens in Australia and New Guinea by at least 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. In the glacial world of lowered seas, the combined land mass of Saho stretches from a northern tip of what is now Queensland to the highlands of New Guinea, separated from the exposed Sunda Shelf by the scattered islands of Wallacea. Even at the lowest sea levels, deep water channels between these islands remain, meaning that the crossing could never be achieved without deliberate movement over open water, the shortest route likely required. Multiple stages from the coast of the Sunda Shelf to islands such as Timor, then onward to smaller stepping stones, and finally across channels tens of kilometers wide to reach the Sahul coast. These voyages may have been aided by sight lines to distant islands visible on clear days and by knowledge of currents and wind patterns learned over generations of coastal and island life. The archaeological evidence for these crossings is indirect, as most early coastal sites are now submerged, yet stone tools and founder remains in northern Australia dated to over 50,000 years ago attest to rapid settlement after arrival, and genetic studies confirm that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans share a deep common ancestry that diverged from other non-African populations soon after leaving Africa. The little-known detail is that these early Sahul settlers carried with them not only African-derived tool traditions, but also genetic contributions from Denisovans acquired somewhere. This Denisovan ancestry remains highest in present-day Papuans and indigenous Australians, a living genetic marker of encounters with another human lineage during the migration. The scientific mystery is whether the crossing to Sahul was a single large migration event or a series of smaller voyages over centuries, with populations building up slowly on the islands before finally establishing a foothold on the Sahul mainland. Some researchers propose a rapid express lane dispersal, while others envision a gradual expansion with intermittent contact and genetic exchange between island and continental populations. From a planetary scale perspective, the colonization of Sahul represents one of the earliest examples of humans crossing a permanent biogeographic boundary. The islands of Wallacea lie within the Wallace Line, a fondal divide that has separated Asian and Australasian ecosystems for millions of years. Crossing it meant entering a new ecological realm with marsupial, dominated terrestrial fauna, giant reptiles, and bird species unlike any encountered before. For the dispersing Homo sapiens, this transition required rapid adaptation in hunting strategies, plant use, and possibly in social organization to meet the demands of unfamiliar landscapes. The skills developed during earlier coastal dispersal, boat building, navigation, fishing, and marine resource exploitation would have been critical in reaching Sahul. Simple rafts or canoes, propelled by paddles or poles, could have carried small groups across each channel, perhaps timed with favorable winds and currents. Fire may have been used to clear vegetation at landing sites, both to make camp and to encourage the growth of useful plants. The archaeological record in Sahul shows early evidence of broad-spectrum subsistence strategies, hunting large marsupials such as Depredon, collecting yams and tubers, fishing in rivers and coastal waters, and burning landscapes to manage plant and animal resources. These practices suggest that the first settlers were not simply surviving in a marginal new environment, but actively shaping it to their needs. Inland travel brought humans into contact with vastly different climates and terrains, from tropical lowlands to alpine grasslands in New Guinea, demonstrating a capacity for rapid ecological adaptation. In many regions, the arrival of humans coincides with the extinction of large-bodied species, a pattern seen on multiple continents. Whether these extinctions in Sahul were the direct result of human hunting habitat alteration through fire or a combination with climate change remains debated. The question of speed, how quickly humans spread across the vast landmass after arrival, is central to understanding this stage. In Australia, sites from the arid interior show occupation within a few thousand years of coastal settlement, implying that humans adapted to desert conditions almost immediately. This expansion inland may have been aided by knowledge of water storage in natural rock holes, plant harvesting techniques, and mobility patterns learned during earlier phases of the dispersal. In the lived present of the journey, the cross into Sahul is not an abstract migration, but a sequence of tangible steps preparing water and food for the voyage. Choosing a calm morning when the horizon is clear, pushing a raft into the shallows and watching the familiar coastline fade behind. The sea crossing is marked by periods of calm paddling, scanning the water for fish or hazards and moments of uncertainty when clouds obscure the next island. Landfall brings a smell of new vegetation, the calls of unfamiliar birds, and the sight of animal tracks in the sand. Camps are established near fresh water, and exploratory trips map the terrain for hunting and gathering. In this moment, the scope of the world has widened irrevocably. The success of this crossing opens entire continents to human settlement and demonstrates that Homo sapiens is not bound by the limits of land. From a genetic and cultural standpoint, the founding populations of Sahul remain relatively isolated from other parts of the world for tens of thousands of years. developing unique traditions, languages, and adaptations. Yet their deep ancestry ties them to the same small African origin population that, only a few millennia earlier, had stood on the shores of the Red Sea. From the planetary view, the settlement of Sahul marks a turning point. Humans have now occupied environments ranging from African savanna to Eurasian steppe, from tropical forests to arid deserts, and now to an entirely new biogeographic realm. This range of adaptation accomplished within a fraction of human evolutionary history underscores the species' extraordinary ecological flexibility. The legacy of this crossing persists not only in the archaeological record, but in the living cultures of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans whose oral histories, land management practices, and deep connection to the landscape may preserve echoes of those earliest arrivals. The footprints of Sahul's first settlers, literal and genetic, remain part of the unbroken chain that began with small bands moving along in African lakeshore, following the rhythms of water season and sky into an ever-widening world. The northern frontier comes into view as some bands of dispersing Homo sapiens turn toward the colder latitudes of Ice Age Europe, advancing through corridors shaped by climate and geography into a land dominated by forest, steppe, and glacier margins. Around 45,000 years ago, Europe is deep. In the Pleian, its northern third, under vast ice sheets. Its southern and central regions a patchwork of open grassland, boreal woodland, and tundra. Winters are long and severe. Summers short but productive, bringing bursts of flowering plants and herds of grazing animals. Neanderthals have occupied this landscape for hundreds of thousands of years and are well adapted to its extremes. The archaeological record shows that Homo sapiens entering Europe brought with them technological traditions distinct from those of the Neanderthals, including finely made blades, bone points, and personal ornaments such as perforated animal teeth and shell beads. Some of these ornaments are found from their natural sources, suggesting long-distance exchange networks or seasonal movement between regions. The little-known detail is that some of the earliest Homo sapiens sites in Europe, such as Bacho Kiro Cave in Bulgaria, contain tools and ornaments that blend African-derived technologies, with innovations likely developed in Eurasia, indicating rapid adaptation to local materials and conditions. The scientific mystery is the pace and nature of interaction between these incoming populations and the Neanderthals they encountered. Genetic evidence confirms interbreeding, adding to the Neanderthal ancestry already present from earlier contacts in the Levant, but the archaeological signs of cultural exchange are harder to interpret. Some researchers see evidence of Neanderthal adoption of Homo sapiens technologies shortly before their disappearance, while others argue for parallel innovation under similar environmental pressures. From a planetary perspective, Europe at this time is part of a wider belt of cold-adapted environments stretching across the northern hemisphere. Glacial advances push vegetation zones southward, creating vast areas of open steppe, tundra rich in grazing species such as mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer, and horse. These animals move in large herds, their migrations offering seasonal opportunities for human hunting. The open terrain allows for long-distance visibility, aiding both tracking and navigation, but it also exposes travelers to wind, snow, and predators. Survival here depends on careful seasonal planning. Camps are located in sheltered valleys or beneath cliffs that block prevailing winds. Fuel is gathered in advance, often in the form of driftwood along rivers or peat from wetlands, as trees are sparse in many regions. Clothing likely made from multiple layers of tailor hide and fur is essential for protection against the cold. The production of such garments is supported by an increased presence of bones and needles in the archaeological record. Tools adapt to the demands of hunting. Large Ice Age fauna, long slender blade points allow for efficient cutting and piercing. Projectile weapons improve hunting efficiency at a distance. Bone and antler are shaped into barbed points for fishing and hunting waterfowl during thaw periods. The versatility of these materials allows for repairs and replacements even when high-quality stone is scarce. Pigments, though less common than in warmer regions, still appear at some sites, sometimes in association with engraved objects or cave paintings. These artistic expressions may have had social or symbolic functions, strengthening group identity or transmitting information across generations. The arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe coincides with a period of climatic instability, with abrupt warming and cooling episodes affecting vegetation and animal distributions. These rapid shifts require flexibility in hunting and foraging strategies, as prey species may alter migration routes or timing from year to year. The archaeological record shows evidence of mobility over large territories with tool stone from distant sources, indicating movement or exchange networks spanning hundreds of kilometers. Interaction with Neanderthals during this period is not limited to genetic exchange. Some Neanderthal sites from their final millennia contain tools and ornaments similar to those of Homo sapiens, suggesting either direct contact or imitation from observation. The nature of these exchanges, whether cooperative, competitive, or neutral, is unknown, but their occurrence highlights the permeability of cultural boundaries when populations overlap. From the broader dispersal perspective, the move into Europe represents both an expansion of range and an increase in environmental challenge. The skills developed in Central Asian steppes, tracking migratory herds, enduring cold, storing food, are now tested against even harsher winters and more fragmented resources. Yet the rewards are substantial. The abundance of large game during favorable seasons can support relatively high population densities and the predictability of certain migration. Routes allow for planned communal hunts. The planetary processes shaping this frontier include the cyclic growth and retreat of ice sheets, shifts in ocean circulation that influence European climate, and the broader glacial, interglacial rhythm of the late Pliene. These forces, though imperceptible on the scale of a single human life structure, the opportunities and constraints for settlement and movement over centuries. In the lived present of dispersal, the northern frontier is a place of contrasts. Days of brilliant low-angle sunlight over snow-covered plains followed by weeks of wind-driven storms. The open visibility of herds moving across frozen ground, countered by the claustrophobic shelter of caves and tents during blizzards. Groups follow river valleys as natural highways their frozen surfaces, sometimes serving as winter travel routes. Fishing is possible during thaw periods, and preserved meat from autumn hunts sustains people through the depths of winter. Contact with other human groups, whether Neanderthals or fellow Homo sapiens, occurs along these corridors, marked by the discovery of distinctive tools, ornaments, or hearth remains in familiar locations. Each encounter carries potential for information exchange, alliance, or avoidance, shaping the human map of the continent. By establishing themselves in Europe, Homo sapiens complete a geographic arc from Africa through Arabia, Central and South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sahul, and now the far west of Eurasia. The species now occupies nearly every major terrestrial biome outside the Americas, demonstrating the full range of an adaptive capacity. The northern frontier, while demanding, is not an end point, but another stage in a continuous process of exploration, adaptation, and settlement that will carry human presence into every habitable region of the planet. Threads of genetic memory run quietly through all the regions reached in the first great dispersal, linking the scattered populations of Homo sapiens outside Africa back to the same small ancestral source. Modern genetic studies show that every non-African person alive today descends from a subset of Africans who left the continent roughly $60,000 to 70,000 years ago, carrying with them only a fraction of the total genetic diversity found within Africa at that time. This founder effect is the legacy of the late Pliene bottlenecks that reduce the number of breeding individuals to small, vulnerable groups. The genetic signatures of that narrowing remain measurable tens of thousands of years, later embedded in every cell along the dispersal routes. These small populations also acquired genetic contributions from other hominin lineages. Neanderthal DNA is present in all non-Africans, typically in the range of 1 to 2% a signal of early encounters, likely in the Levant or Western Asia. In certain populations, particularly in Oceania and parts of Southeast Asia, Denisovan DNA appears as well, sometimes in higher proportions than Neanderthal ancestry. These introgress sequences are not random. Some affect traits such as immune system, function, adaptation to high altitude and skin physiology, suggesting that interbreeding provided genetic advantages in unfamiliar environments. The little-known detail is that some adaptive genes linked to pathogen resistance in Eurasian populations today trace back to Neanderthal origins, indicating that ancient contact may have improved survival against local diseases. Similarly, a Denisovan-derived gene found in present-day Tibetans is associated with improved oxygen transport at high altitude, though when and where it entered, the human lineage remains uncertain. The scientific mystery lies in the complexity of these exchanges. The genetic record shows multiple points of contact with both Neanderthals and Denis, suggesting that interbreeding was not a single event, but a recurring possibility whenever ranges overlapped. Yet the archaeological evidence for these meetings is sparse, and the social context, whether these encounters involved long-term cohabitation, short-term alliances, or isolated interactions, remains unknown. From a planetary perspective, the dispersal routes of Homo sapiens and other hominins overlapped in a dynamic landscape shaped by climate change, sea level shifts, and habitat expansion, or contraction, periods of warming open corridors that allowed populations to move and interact. Colder phases could isolate groups for thousands of years. Over time, these cycles created a patchwork of contact zones and refugia, places where genetic exchange could occur and others where populations evolved separately. The genetic threads also record the distances traveled. Specific genetic markers can be traced from East Africa into the Middle East onward to South Asia, then into Southeast Asia and Oceania, each step reflecting both movement and the genetic drift that comes from small groups founding new settlements. The farther from Africa, the less genetic diversity remains, not because of selection against certain traits, but because each migration involved only part of the original variation. This serial founder effect means that populations at the far ends of the dispersal path, such as those in South America, much later carry the smallest subset of the genetic diversity once present in Africa. In the context of survival, reduced diversity can make populations more vulnerable to disease or environmental stress. Yet, it can also fix adaptive traits quickly if they confer an advantage. Archaeology and genetics together provide a framework for understanding how these early humans responded to the challenges of new environments. Sites across Eurasia, Sahul, and eventually the Americas show regional adaptations, different tool types, food sources, and settlement patterns that arose within the constraints of the inherited genetic makeup. Cultural innovations could spread more quickly than genes, allowing small genetically similar populations to diversify their behaviors dramatically in response to local conditions. The persistence of certain cultural elements across wide distances, such as prepared core stone tool technology or the use of pigments, suggests that the founding populations carried a shared set of skills and symbolic practices that survived despite geographic separation. Yet over time, isolation and adaptation produced distinct traditions, just as genetic drift and selection produced regional biological differences. The planetary scale forces that drove these processes continued long after the first dispersal. Glacial cycles altered coastlines, flooded or exposed land bridges, and shifted climate zones, changing the opportunities for contact between populations. When sea levels rose after the last glacial maximum. Many early coastal sites were submerged, erasing evidence of the roots and interactions that genetic data still hint at. The lived presence of these genetic threads during dispersal is invisible to the people themselves. They do not know that their skin, hair, or immune responses carry traces of other human species. They do not measure their relatedness to distant groups by DNA. What they experience is the familiarity of certain faces within their own group, the recognition of shared tool-making techniques, the patterns of speech and gesture that mark kinship. Encounters with others, whether similar or subtly different, are judged in the moment by signs of alliance or threat, not by abstract ancestry. Yet with each meeting, whether peaceful or tense genes, and ideas can pass from one lineage to another, weaving a network that will millennia later be reconstructed in laboratories and mapped across continents. The permanence of these genetic contributions contrasts with the impermanence of most material culture. Tools without pigments fade, shelters collapse. But the genetic sequences, inherited from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other early populations, remain carried silently through thousands of generations. These sequences do not tell a complete story. They cannot reveal the words spoken at first meetings or the negotiations that made exchange possible, but they anchor the reality that the first dispersal was not a journey undertaken by a single isolated species. It was an expansion into a world already occupied by other humans, each with their own deep history skills and adaptations. From the planetary viewpoint, the genetic legacy of these encounters is as much a part of Earth's changing biosphere as the shifting of forests and grasslands under glacial and interglacial climates. Genes like seeds move with carriers into new habitats, where they may thrive, vanish, or lie dormant until conditions bring them to the fore. In the unbroken continuity of life, the threads of genetic memory are both a record of where humans have been and a resource for where they can survive. As the dispersal continues into its later stages, these threads bind the scattered populations into a single, though increasingly diverse species, one that carries within it the traces of all its journeys, encounters, and adaptations since the first small groups began to walk away from Africa's shores. Mysteries in the record persist even after decades of excavation, genetic sequencing, and climate modeling, leaving parts of the first great dispersal story in shadow. The routes taken out of Africa remain debated, while the southern route across Bab el-Mandeb into Arabia is supported by genetic and archaeological evidence. Some researchers argue for a northern path through the Sinai Peninsula into the Levant, either as an alternative or a concurrent stream of migration. The timing is also uncertain. Fossils and tools in the Levant from more than 100,000 years ago show that Homo sapiens reached Eurasia well before the $60,000 70,000-year window, usually linked to the ancestry of all living non-Africans. These earlier dispersals may have ended in local extinction or been absorbed by later arrivals, leaving little or no genetic trace. The little-known detail is that some coastal cave sites in South Africa preserve evidence of advanced tool use, symbolic artifacts, and marine exploitation dating back 90,000 years or more, raising the possibility that the capacity for long-range dispersal existed long before it was fully realized. This raises a scientific mystery of why the successful global expansion did not occur earlier. Was it climate change that opened corridors at just the right time? Did population density, technological innovation, or social networks need to reach a threshold before dispersal could be sustained? Or were earlier expansions simply erased by environmental catastrophe competition or assimilation into other populations? From a planetary perspective, the gaps in the record are partly a product of geology and sea level change. The most likely migration routes, coasts, river valleys, and lowland corridors are also the places most likely to have been submerged or heavily eroded since the late Plein. In regions like the Arabian Peninsula, much of the ancient shoreline lies beneath modern seas, hiding the campsites and middens that would directly record the first steps into new continents. Inland sediment deposition, erosion, and tectonic activity can obscure or destroy archaeological layers, leaving only fragmentary clues. The result is an incomplete and uneven distribution of evidence, with some regions yielding a detailed sequence and others offering only scattered points of data. Another unresolved question concerns the nature of contact between dispersing Homo sapiens and other hominin species. Genetic evidence confirms interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, but the fossil and archaeological record rarely preserves direct evidence of such encounters. Were these interactions occasional and opportunistic, or sustained and structured? Did they involve exchanges of technology, territory, or ritual? The blending of tool traditions in certain areas could be interpreted as evidence of shared knowledge, but it could also result from parallel adaptation to similar environments. Without clear context, the exact nature of these relationships remains speculative. The mystery extends the pace of dispersal. Some models based on genetic divergence rates suggest a relatively rapid spread from Africa to Australia within a few thousand years, while others propose slower movement with long pauses in favorable regions. Archaeological gaps can make either scenario appear plausible depending on interpretation. For example, the rapid appearance of Homo sapiens artifacts in Sahul shortly after the supposed departure from Africa supports the fast dispersal model, but the absence of continuous evidence along the route leaves room for alternative timelines. Climate records add another layer of complexity. The period between 60,000 tons and 50,000 years ago includes abrupt climate events, rapid warming and cooling episodes, shifts in monsoon, strength that could have alternately opened and closed migration corridors. The dispersal may have advanced in bursts during favorable phases and stalled during harsher intervals. This pulse movement would explain both the rapid occupation of distant lands and the patchy archaeological trail from the perspective of those living through it. These mysteries are not questions. They are the lived conditions of existence. People move when resources dwindle, when weather shifts, when game changes its migration patterns, or when news of better land filters through social networks. Routes are chosen not by an overarching plan to colonize the globe, but by a series of immediate decisions based on local knowledge and opportunity. Some bands push forward into unknown territory, others stay in place, and some turn back. Over generations, these choices accumulate into a global movement, but no single group experiences it as such. The planetary forces that will puzzle future researchers are simply the backdrop to daily survival. The gaps in the record also reflect the scale of human presence. Early dispersing populations were small, numbering in the hundreds or low thousands, and their camps left only the lightest trace stone flakes, hearth charcoal, a few bones. Many of these traces would disappear within decades under the action of wind and vegetation. The surviving sites are the exceptions, caves that preserve sediment layers, dry shelters that protected artifacts from weathered shores where deposition buried evidence quickly. This selectivity means that the story told by archaeology is necessarily partial set of scattered windows into a continuous but largely invisible process. Genetic data fill some of these gaps, but raise new puzzles. Certain genetic lineages that should be present in modern populations if they descended from all known fossil groups are absent, suggesting that some populations contributed little or nothing to later humanity. Whether these lineages disappeared through competition, drift, or isolation remains unknown. Conversely, the persistence of other lineages in unexpected places hints at migrations not yet fully documented in the archaeological record. From the global vantage, the dispersal is a braided stream of movement, interaction, and extinction. Some branches flow into others, carrying with them both genetic and cultural material. Others dry up, leaving only a faint mark. In the record, the planet's shifting climates, coastlines, and ecologies are the channels through which these streams run, sometimes merging, sometimes diverging in the live present. The people whose traces we now seek are not aware of being part of a pattern that will span continents. They are aware only of their own path, the trail ahead, the next source of water, the signs of animals in the dust, the location of other groups relative to their own. The mysteries in a record are for them the normal state of the world, the uncertainty of what lies beyond the horizon, the unpredictability of weather and game, the questions of who else might be encountered in a new valley or along a riverbank. The fragments we recover, flakes of stone, beads of shell, residues of pigment, are enough to show that these people were skilled, mobile, and adaptive, yet they leave us with a story full of spaces that can be filled only with cautious inference. In this way, the record mirrors a journey itself, continuous in reality, intermittent in what survives, shaped as much by absence as by presence, a world, forever changed, emerges from the completion of the first great dispersal. As Homo sapiens now occupy nearly every habitable region of Africa, Eurasia, and Sahel, from a few thousand individuals in a shifting African landscape, the lineage has spread over deserts, forests, high mountains, ice margins, tropical coasts, and vast grasslands. The genetic threads carried from that original population now run through billions of descendants, though the world they inhabit bears little resemblance to the one left behind. The dispersal is not an endpoint, but the beginning of a new global dynamic human presence reshaping ecosystems and, in turn, being reshaped by them. The planetary context remains in constant motion. Ice sheets advance and retreat. Sea levels rise and fall by more than 100 m. Coastlines are redrawn, and climates oscillate between wetter and drier extremes. These changes will continue to influence where humans live, how they move, and what they eat. But unlike earlier hominin expansions, this dispersal has set in motion a process of continual adaptation that is both biological and cultural. In genetic terms, the founding populations outside Africa carry reduced diversity compared to their ancestors, the result of the bottlenecks and serial founder effects that marked their journey. Yet through interbreeding with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly other lineages now lost, they also carry traits not present in Africa alone. Some of these genetic legacies will prove beneficial in particular environments. Others will persist simply as markers of contact over tens of millennia. Mutation drift and natural selection will further shape the genome in response to local conditions from high-altitude plateaus to polar latitudes, from humid tropics to arid basins. The little-known detail is that certain immune system genes derived from archaic humans remain active in modern populations, influencing responses to pathogens and allergens. These are not just remnants of past contact, but ongoing factors in human health and disease. Culturally, the dispersal has created isolated experiments in adaptation. Groups in Sahel developed lifeways suited to marsupial-dominated ecosystems using fire to manage landscapes and exploiting a mix of plant and marine resources. In Ice Age, Europe clothing, shelter, and hunting strategies evolved to meet the demands of long winters and migratory megafauna. In tropical Southeast Asia, navigation, fishing, and forest foraging skills allow survival in environments where seasonal cycles are driven by monsoons. The archaeological record shows both continuity with African origins and innovation in response to local challenges. Pigments, beads, and symbolic markings appear in widely separated regions, hinting at a shared heritage of symbolic thought, while regional tool types diverge, reflecting available materials and specific needs. The scientific mystery that remains is how much of this innovation is independent and how much is a result of contact between groups. Even in the deep past, networks of exchange may have spanned hundreds of kilometers, transmitting ideas as well as goods. The full extent of these networks is difficult to reconstruct as organic. Materials and perishable items, baskets, nets, wooden tools rarely survive. From a planetary perspective, the human presence is now a factor in ecological change. Fire regimes shift as landscapes are burned for hunting or promote useful plants. Large animals, some naive to human predation, become targets for hunting. And in many regions, extinction follows within a few thousand years of human arrival, whether caused directly by hunting, indirectly through habitat alteration, or in combination with climate change. These losses alter food webs and reshape ecosystems. This capacity to affect the environment is not yet industrial or global, but it is significant enough to mark the arrival of humans in the fossil and pollen record. The dispersal also changes a human relationship to scale. In Africa, most travel occurs within familiar territories or seasonal ranges, but the expansion into Eurasia and Sahul demands journeys of hundreds or thousands of kilometers over a few generations. Knowledge is passed along that allows children to grow up in landscapes their grandparents never saw. The map in human minds now spans deserts, seas, mountain passes, and rivers beyond the horizon. This mental expansion is as important as the physical one, fostering the ability to plan for unknown conditions, store knowledge of distant places, and integrate new resources into established lifeways. In the lived present of the final stage, there is no awareness of having completed a world-changing event. Families wake in camps beside frozen rivers, in coastal shelters and highland valleys and tropical forests. They hunt, gather fish, and make tools. They teach the next generation where to find water, when the rains will come, and how to track game. They encounter others sometimes familiar, sometimes strange, and the outcomes of these meetings range from exchange to avoidance to conflict. The scale of the dispersal is invisible to them, yet their lives are its substance. The archaeological and genetic record will preserve only fragments of this lived reality. A blade core on a river, terrace, a pigment-stained shell in a midden, a burial with ornaments of bone and tooth. From the modern perspective, these fragments can be assembled into a broad narrative that connects sites across continents and genomes across millennia. But the narrative is necessarily partial, built from what survives and shaped by the questions we ask. The planetary processes that guided the dispersal will continue beyond it. The last glacial maximum will come and go. Ice will melt, seas will rise, and new migrations will occur. In the Holene, agriculture will emerge independently in multiple regions. Cities will rise and human populations will grow exponentially. The small founder groups who first left Africa will be the ancestors of them, all their legacy carried forward not just in genes and tools, but in the capacity to adapt to any environment encountered. The unifying fact is that all non-African humans share this origin, regardless of the diversity that will later emerge. The end of the first great dispersal is thus not a closing chapter, but a threshold. Humanity now lives on a planetary scale, connected by ancestry and separated by geography, climate, and culture. The ecological, genetic, and cultural patterns set in motion during this expansion will shape the course of human history. From a distance of tens of thousands of years, this period will appear as a single decisive wave of movement, but up close, it is revealed as countless individual journeys, fires lit against cold winds, shelters built against rain, food shared between camps, and paths traced by memory and the stars. The world has changed because humans now inhabit it in its entirety, and humans have changed because the world they occupy demands and rewards adaptability. The dispersal's legacy is not only in where people are, but in what they have become, a species that carries with it the imprint of every landscape it has crossed, every climate it has endured, and every other human it has met along the way. The story slows. Now its arc complete, leaving only the quiet acknowledgement of what is known and what will remain unknown. Across the 60,000 to 70,000 years since, small groups of Homo sapiens stepped away from Africa's familiar shores. The evidence forms a chain of islands, archaeological sites, genetic markers, climate records separated by vast seas of silence. Between each known point lies a span of lived experience that cannot be fully recovered. The conversations around a fire, the negotiations with strangers, the careful teaching of a child to read the tracks of an animal or the shape of a coastline. The scale of time blurs individual lives into the sweep of migration. Yet the migration was nothing more and nothing less than the accumulation of individual lives. The archaeological record gives us only what can survive. The chemistry of soil and stonework flint, pigment-stained shells, charred bone imprints of ancient hearths. The genetic record preserves other traces, sequences past, from parent to child, carrying with them fragments of Neanderthal or Denisovan, DNA inherited without awareness, but shaping survival in subtle ways. These lines of evidence tell us where and when, but rarely how it felt to live. At the edge of the known world, the little-known detail is that even in the most thoroughly studied dispersal routes, the majority of the evidence remains undiscovered. Buried beneath sediment, forest, or sea, modern coastlines do not match the coasts our ancestors knew. Much of the terrain they walked is now drowned by post-glacial seas. This means a record is not simply incomplete. It is structurally biased toward the few environments that preserve human traces. Well, the scientific mystery that lingers is whether a fuller record, if it could be recovered, would confirm our current outlines of dispersal or reveal entirely different patterns, routes not yet considered, encounters. Never guess, adaptations that leave little material trace. From a planetary perspective, the first great dispersal is a single pulse in the long rhythm of Earth's climate and life. Ice advanced and retreated, desert spread and contracted, coastline shifted by hundreds of kilom. Homo sapiens, a species that had evolved in Africa's varied environments, rode these changes outward, responding to the same pressures and opportunities that shape all species. Yet, unlike other animals moving with the climate, humans carried knowledge tools and social bonds that allowed them to cross barriers of sea, desert, and cold. The dispersal is thus both a biological expansion and a cultural one, each reinforcing the other. The world was never empty during this movement. Other humans had been there, before Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in parts of Asia and Oceania, perhaps other lineages now lost of fossil record. Each encounter was an exchange, whether of genes, ideas, or territory. These meetings ensured that the humans who reached the farthest edges of the world were not genetically or culturally identical to those who had first left Africa, but carried the imprint of the people they met along the way. These imprints are permanent, woven into our species' shared inheritance. The dispersal's completion brought humans into nearly every ecological zone on Earth outside the Americas, which would come later. Tropical coasts, alpine plateaus, glacial margins, and island archipelagos all became part of the human map. The adaptations forged in this period, technologies for hunting, clothing, shelter navigation, and resource management would form a foundation for all subsequent human history. Even agriculture cities and modern states rest on the survival strategies and mobility patterns honed during the late Pleistocene. Yet much of the knowledge from this time was practical, ephemeral, and unrecorded except in its outcomes. Skills like predicting tides, locating hidden springs, or identifying edible plants in new environments were passed on directly, not inscribed. They shaped survival as surely as genetic traits, but left no durable trace. This absence is part of the reason the dispersal feels from today's vantage like a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. The absence, however, is not failure. It is the normal condition of the past. The overwhelming majority of what happens leaves no record. What does survive is enough to show the scale and significance of the first great dispersal, and enough to remind us that there is always more beyond our reach. In the lived present of the final, afterward, the pace of the narrative slows to match the pace of its subject. The movement was not constant. It paused, reversed, and resumed according to climate resources and human choice. For those who lived it, there was no sense of being part of the species level expansion. There was only the next camp, the next hunt, the next season. Yet in aggregate, these unremarkable decisions carried humans from a single region into a global range. The world forever changed not because it was suddenly filled with people, but because it now contained a species that could in time fill it. From the planetary scale, the dispersal marks the moment when human history becomes global. The map of movement traced in genes and artifacts is the outline of our shared origin. Every person living outside Africa today carries a legacy of those first migrants, not as an abstract heritage, but as a biological fact in the architecture of their genome and the echoes of ancient adaptations. The earth remembers too in change fire regimes, in the altered ranges of animals and plants, in the disappearance of some species and the spread of others, alongside human movement. What is eternal in humanity is not any single technology or genetic trait, but the capacity to adapt through a combination of inherited knowledge, social cooperation, and the ability to learn from new conditions. These qualities present in the small bands who began the journey remain in the billions who live today. The first great dispersal is thus both a chapter in prehistory and an ongoing condition. We are still a species in motion, shaped by movement as much as by place. The silence that follows this story is not emptiness, but space. Space for the lives lived between the points we can name, for the landscapes that once held them, for the unknowable details of choice and chance that shaped the path. The fires they built have long gone cold. The shelters collapsed. The footprints eroded, but the line of descent is unbroken. That line passes through every living human outside Africa, carrying forward the genetic, cultural, and ecological legacy of those first journeys. The story ends where it began, with small groups of humans standing at the edge of the known, looking toward land or water they have never crossed, deciding quietly, without knowing the full consequence to